Evelyn gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The road stretched ahead, an endless black ribbon unspooling into the night. She'd been driving for hours, the miles blurring into a monotonous drone. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh of the wind. She was tired, bone-tired, and just wanted to be home. Her eyelids felt heavy, but she fought the urge to close them. She had to stay focused. She had to get home. The thought of her warm bed and a cup of tea kept her going. She pressed on, the darkness pressing in around her. The car's headlights cut through the inky blackness. The world outside the car was a void, swallowed by the night. Trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The heater in her old car wasn't working, and the chill of the autumn night seeped into the cabin. She glanced at the fuel gauge, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. It was dangerously low. She hoped she could make it to the next town. She really didn't want to be stranded out here. Not tonight. The road seemed to stretch on forever, each mile feeling longer than the last. She turned up the radio, hoping to find some music to break the oppressive silence. Only static crackled back at her, the sound grating on her already frayed nerves. She sighed, switching it off again. The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She focused on the road, trying to ignore the growing unease that prickled at her skin, the feeling that she was being watched. She hummed a tuneless melody to herself, trying to keep her spirits up. The road twisted and turned, the darkness seeming to deepen with every curve. She strained her eyes, peering into the gloom. The world outside the car was a blur of shadows and shapes, the darkness playing tricks on her tired mind. She imagined things lurking just beyond the reach of her headlights, things that watched her from the shadows. She shook her head, trying to dispel the unsettling thoughts. A thick fog began to roll in, swirling around the car like a ghostly shroud. Visibility dropped dramatically, the world outside reduced to a hazy, indistinct blur. The fog was thick, clinging to the road like a damp blanket. It swirled and eddied around the car, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. She slowed down, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. The fog seemed to press in on her, suffocating her. It felt like she was driving through a cloud, disconnected from the world. The headlights struggled to penetrate the dense fog, their beams swallowed by the swirling whiteness. The road ahead was barely visible, a pale ribbon disappearing into the swirling mist. She squinted, trying to make out the road markings. The fog seemed to distort everything, making the familiar road seem alien and unsettling. She felt lost, adrift in a sea of white. The world outside the car had vanished, swallowed by the fog. The air grew heavy, thick with moisture. The fog clung to her skin, cold and clammy. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The inside of the car felt damp, the fog seeming to seep in through the cracks and crevices. The windows fogged up, further reducing her visibility. She wiped them clear with her sleeve, but the fog quickly returned, obscuring her view once more. She felt trapped, boxed in by the swirling white mist. The silence of the fog was unnerving, broken only by the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers. The world outside was a silent white void. She felt completely alone, isolated in the swirling mist. The fog seemed to amplify every small sound, making them seem louder and more ominous. The creak of the car, the hum of the engine, even her own breathing seemed amplified in the silence. The fog was a living thing, pressing in on her, suffocating her. Something darted across the road in front of her, a fleeting shadow in the fog. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the damp road. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She peered into the fog, trying to see what it was, but there was nothing there, just the swirling white mist. Had she imagined it? She couldn't be sure. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. It was probably just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the image of the shadow lingered in her mind, dark and unsettling. It had moved too quickly, too purposefully to be an animal. She tried to dismiss the thought, but a nagging feeling of unease remained. What if it hadn't been an animal? She slowly released the brakes, her foot hovering over the accelerator. She hesitated, unsure whether to continue. But she was so close to home, just a few more miles. She couldn't turn back now, not with the fog closing in around her. She took another deep breath and pressed down on the accelerator, the car moving forward once more into the swirling mist. The image of the shadow still haunted her, a dark stain on the white canvas of the fog. She drove slowly, her eyes scanning the road ahead. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, the visibility decreasing with every passing moment. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The tension in her shoulders was almost unbearable. She felt like she was driving through a nightmare, the fog a tangible manifestation of her fear. The fleeting shadow had shaken her, leaving her with a sense of unease that she couldn't shake off. She turned on the radio again, desperate for any sound to break the oppressive silence. Static crackled through the speakers, the sound grating on her nerves. But then, a voice emerged from the static, faint and distorted. It whispered her name, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from right behind her. She gasped, spinning around in her seat, but the car was empty. She stared at the radio, her eyes wide with fear. The voice was gone, replaced once more by the crackling static. She reached out and switched the radio off, her hand trembling. Had she imagined it? She had to have. It was just the fog playing tricks on her mind. The fog and the darkness and the isolation were getting to her. She was starting to imagine things. She tried to rationalize what she had heard. It was probably just a stray radio signal, she told herself, a trick of the atmosphere. But the voice had sounded so real, so close. She couldn't shake the feeling that it had been meant for her, that someone or something was trying to communicate with her. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She drove on, the silence in the car now heavier than ever. The fog was pressing in on her, suffocating her. She felt like she was losing her mind. The voice on the radio, the fleeting shadow, the oppressive fog, it was all too much. She just wanted to be home, safe and sound in her own bed. But home felt a million miles away. A figure emerged from the fog, standing in the middle of the road. It was tall and slender, its features obscured by the swirling mist. She slammed on the brakes again, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. She stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was it? And what were they doing standing in the middle of the road in this fog? She honked the horn, the sound echoing eerily in the stillness. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and motionless, as if unaware of her presence. She honked again, longer this time, the sound sharp and insistent. Still, the figure didn't react. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the swirling white mist. It was as if it was rooted to the spot. She leaned out of the window, her voice trembling. "Hello!" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. The figure remained motionless, its features still hidden by the fog. A wave of fear washed over her. This was not normal. This was not right. She considered getting out of the car. Maybe the figure needed help, but something held her back. A primal fear deep in her gut told her to stay inside. She didn't know why, but she knew that it was not safe to approach the figure. The fog seemed to writhe around it as if it were a part of the mist itself. She put the car in reverse, her hands shaking. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the figure. It still hadn't moved. She turned the car around, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get out of here. She had to get home. She pressed down on the accelerator, the car speeding away from the figure and back into the swirling fog. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog. She let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with relief. She had escaped. She was safe. But as she drove on, the feeling of unease returned, stronger than ever. She couldn't shake the image of the figure from her mind. It had felt so real, so menacing. She reached her hand up to adjust the rearview mirror and froze. Her blood ran cold. Sitting in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead with empty eyes, was the figure. Its face was pale and gaunt, its features sharp and angular. Its eyes were dark and lifeless, staring straight ahead. It was the same figure from the road. She screamed, a primal scream of terror that tore through the silence of the fog. The car swerved violently, the tires screeching against the road. She lost control, the car spinning out of control and crashing into a ditch. The world went black,